So the next thing we're going to talk about, I don't have any more slides. I'm sorry.
Oh, darn.
Is we're just gonna talk about some basic reading. But before we talk about some basic reading you can do on your own to learn about things, the first thing you should know is that some of this stuff is really difficult, and uh, don't be afraid to ask people. Don't be afraid to be ignorant. In fact, if you just pick up a book by Lacan for the first time, and that's your entry into psychoanalysis, um, be prepared for the difficulty. One of the whole principles of psychoanalysis is that the analyst should not be the master, right? That just like the hypnotist would tell somebody to feel better, that is sort of a form of authoritarianism and domination that psychoanalysis is designed to be against, right? The analyst is not supposed to be the superego. And so Lacan is being deliberately difficult a lot of the time as a way of saying, you shouldn't feel like you've mastered the human psyche. And that's very frustrating. We just want to be like this, Jacques, just say what you mean, right? But at the same time, the basic impulse is in fact correct, that if you feel like you've mastered the human psyche, maybe you misunderstood what the point of psychoanalysis was. That being said, the best place to start is with Freud. Freud's introductory lectures are in particular very good and very accessible and have lots of basic examples in them. The two essays that I recommend to my students to start off with when they're reading psychoanalysis is from introductory lectures, and it's The Sense of Symptoms and Fixation to Traumas. Exactly what we've been talking about here. You might also benefit from reading what is called one of Freud's meta-psychological papers called The Unconscious. That's the title, just The Unconscious. Freud wrote a series of, I think, 4 papers called the meta-psychological papers, where he was really being abstract and structural about the theory of psychoanalysis. And The Unconscious is more difficult, but you might want to read that as a good advanced Freud thing. If you've got a lot of time, The Interpretation of Dreams is a great thing to read. It's pretty clear, and also you'll be able to follow along. Freud will talk about dreams, and you will have those dreams, and it'll be really quite interesting. For Lacan, I think that you should any card that you find that you think makes sense, go back and get that article and read that article. A very popular author as an explainer of Lacan as a debate argument is McGowan, and McGowan's stuff is usually pretty accessible. Also, Slavoj Žižek is the most famous Lacanian analyst writing today for good reason, because he uses a lot of examples from popular culture to explain really difficult stuff. In particular, yeah, exactly, Žižek's jokes. In particular, from his book, The Plague of Fantasies, I believe, the chapters Love Thy Neighbor and The Seven Veils of Fantasy are particularly good, and they're debate classics. Some of the very first modern psychoanalysis arguments, not some of I think the very first modern psychoanalysis arguments were run out of the articles, the chapters of this Zizek book, The Plague of Fantasies. There's also, if you want something longer from Zizek, there's also The Sublime Objective Ideology. That's a little bit more difficult, but it's very politically oriented and gives a lot of examples of how political practice is linked to psychoanalytic concepts. And so that's also very useful as well. Mostly, though, I think that you have to recognize that you're embarking on learning about something that's very difficult, and you can't be afraid of the difficulty. Use your resources, talk to people you know about it. Read other people reading things, so that the more number of perspectives you have about it will help you sort of figure out what the differences and the important things are. And last, I think that starting with Freud is actually really key, because Freud is a really good lucid writer, and his concepts are the foundation for the more difficult stuff you might find in Lacan.
That's fair. One thing that I recommend to my students, and something that I do myself, is I think interviews are oftentimes very underutilized in debaters understanding things, because sometimes it's nice to just hear like a dialogue between like a thinker and someone else about their ideas. Are there any specific people that you think like give particularly good interviews? McGowan, I know in particular, has made a lot of appearances on Leftist Theory podcast that I follow. There will probably be like a written up reading list that we attach to like this lecture, and I'll be sure to include some of that. But are there any thinkers that you think like are particularly good in terms of like being interviewed, or examples of just anything like that come to mind?
For Lacan, yes. I mean, McGowan. Those like I'm not familiar with the podcast, but yes, I think they're a very good explicator. If you see Zizek do a Q&A session live, it's usually pretty enlightening, although it can get a little bit wild and off the rails. I think that I think the example that you gave is actually a pretty good one. I think that Adam Phillips is a Freudian analyst who is he wrote a book that's got the word Houdini in the title. I really like one of the essays in it. I teach it fairly often. And he's a very good down-to-earth explicator of sort of Freudian theory, but also in a more sort of contemporary setting. So do you want to talk about just a quick overview of how you can use Lacan in arguments?
That's what I was about to sort of ask if we transition to. Just you mentioned just hypothetical scenarios, examples, like debate applications, context, etc. I think that would be a sort of good place to end it, since we've already gone a bit over time, but I don't have anywhere to be if you don't.
The biggest argument in psychoanalysis is that what people say motivates them isn't actually what motivates them, and that people can be in love with their own oppression. They can be passionately attached to their own traumas. I believe that's a phrase that comes from Judith Butler uses, and that what people say, their conscious utterance, isn't necessarily the level on which their true meaning is entered into the world. We can see this in politicians all the time, just reading below the surface. But also, we can think of this as a critique of leftist politics as well as a critique of rightist politics, right? That a lot of times activists are being morally righteous while being politically counterproductive. And that to understand what our investments are in various forms of activism and politics can help us understand when those forms of activism and politics go bad, why they fail, and how they could succeed in the future, right? So the basic disconnect between the statement of a discourse and the way the discourse actually operates and how it functions, and the fact that people who truly believe righteously that what they're doing are good can be passionately attached to their own oppression in ways that they don't understand, I think is a powerful combination of arguments. Whether you're critiquing dominant hegemonic political discourse or whether you're critiquing critique. Second, I think that this idea of scapegoating is one of the foundational arguments in psychoanalysis, that political utopianism, fantasies of national wholeness, etc., lead to things falling out and then being scapegoated. An athlete wrote a psychoanalysis argument against a long time ago was about wildlife reserves in Africa. And the argument was pretty simple, that this fantasy of the pristine wilderness actually is used to scapegoat the people who actually live in those wildernesses, including indigenous or nomadic peoples, but also just the Africans who have to make an existence of their lives. And that actually led to violence, like paramilitary style violence in some of those places, right? And so the fantasy of something good, pristine wilderness, preserving nature, which nobody is against, became, as a utopian moment, a way of scapegoating actually existing peoples and oppressing them in those situations, right? And that can be applied to almost any topic, criminal justice, et cetera, et cetera. Here's another example. A third thing, so disconnect between discourse and effects of discourse, scapegoating and utopianism. And a last big category I'll give is
funky. I like it.
Yeah, Okay, this is something I plan on talking about, so you have to give me a second to think about it. Freudian slip. I forgot about it for a reason. Is a critique of the theories behind different political worldviews. So if you think about hedge good authors or American leadership good authors like Thayer, who talk about stuff in the background like bioessentialism and stuff like that, and also other international realists who sort of have these understandings of their models of the human actor.
So
right?
these are your Mearsheimers, your Kagan cards, your sort of just like hedge good updates that you cut from the Heritage Foundation, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, but this could apply to anything that has a theory of how human action works. You can critique it on the basis of their model of the psyche is off, and that the next step, the impact, would be why that will lead to outcomes that you didn't expect, unintended outcomes that will make the problem worse.
Could you sort of give an example, I guess, of how, like, for example, just like using the hegemony good example, like what psychoanalysts say? I know, like, the cards that I'm thinking of in this context are like the Solomon cards, and I believe, didn't you study under Solomon?
Maybe.
Maybe?
I did study under somebody named Solomon, but yes.
Yeah. But no, just like, could you give just an example of just like, if I'm debating a hedge good F and I want to go for psychoanalysis, how should like, we're going to say hedge good F. How should I sort of play out, like, the sort of link debatings, the sort of way I would sort of generate links to sort of theory of hegemony, realism, etc., what the impacts to those link arguments would be, and maybe how I would frame the alternative question in that debate.
So we could do all three link levels against a hedge F, right? The first would be that their theory of the human is bad and will lead to bad outcomes. If you believe that humans operate like that, when they don't, what do? Step number 2, scapegoat them, right? And say, these people are bad people. They're terrorists that don't conform to our notion of what good political actors are. And thus they must be eliminated, including doing really horrible stuff to them, like engaging in ethnocidal cleansing campaigns or torture, a la Abu Ghraib and Guantanamo Bay, right? And third, you could layer on there that you should take a look at the actions that these people do and not the sounds good discourse that they purvey, right? The discourse of American exceptionalism and leadership inevitably leads to bad stuff like funding proxy wars and threatening nuclear extinction against all of the people. And that disconnect and the disavowals of, because fundamentally, when they make those arguments, they'll be saying things like, you should ignore all the bad stuff because the good stuff is more important, right? I.e., the good fantasy is more important than the actually existing bad historical outcomes. And
so sort of like critiquing the frame of like necessary evils, or like it's all for a good cause. You know, like the phrase that obviously comes to mind is like the road to hell is paved with good intentions.
Yeah,
that sort of thought process.
When it comes to alternatives, there's a lot of different examples. Traditional one is just the sort of psychoanalysis itself as an alternative. An example of a classic example from a card is that if you go to see the analyst because your spouse is cheating on you and you're have this sort of you're pathological about it, right? And you're aggressive and you're violent. Even if they're cheating on you, that doesn't take away the pathology of it, right? And so it's not necessarily what a situation is, it's your relationship to that situation.
So,
and if you, let's give an example of like just like coronavirus testing, right? If your orientation towards the situation is that the pandemic is just the flu, even if you give billions of dollars to testing, the way that that's going to get implemented is going to be filtered through the actors and the way they perceive what they're doing, and it's not going to mean anything. The same amount of money for the same program that's being propagated and implemented for different reasons is going to function entirely differently. And if you read some of the psychoanalysis and policymaking literature, you can find examples of stuff like that out there. So it becomes less a question of what do you do, but how do you do it, right? And that the role of the judge becomes to intervene in the discourse of the affirmative and interrupt it. So not so that whatever policy they're making doesn't get implemented, but that their way of implementing it doesn't happen.
That's fair. So going back to the example of like the person who goes to the analyst because they think their wife is cheating on them, it doesn't matter whether or not it's actually true that they're being cheated on, that their spouse is, stepping out on them. What matters is more their relationship to that idea, and like whether it's true or not, the relationship that they have to that, the sort of pathology of it, is still one that like is valid and needs to be dealt with, regardless of the truth of the matter. Right. So the process of analysis would be sort of looking into the relationship and just sort of thinking like, why are you so upset by this? Right. Sort of like what sort of traumas are animating your response to this, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah. I also think that it's less of a question of the people in the debate room, right? You're not a critique of them. It's not a personal attack, right? It's a critique of the discourse that they put out there to be evaluated and judged, right? You're not saying they're bad people. You're saying the discourse that they have asked the judge to adopt participates in a fantasy of wholeness that will lead to violence, right? And it's not their intention to do that, right? But that's one of the points of psychoanalysis, is that your intentions at the end of the day might be a lot less important than you think they are.
That makes sense.
So I think that's also a trick of executing the argument, is like you're not giving your opponent an analytic session, right? You're not qualified to do that, right? And two, it's not personal, right? They presented a discourse to be evaluated, right? You're evaluating it. It's totally impersonal, has nothing to do with the individuals. And the idea that every time we look at psychological motivations, it's an attack on the individuals, that's our argument, right? That is a bad relationship to questions of desire, enjoyment, and the psyche. If people who think their motivations can never be questioned, you should be deeply suspicious of that type of political discourse.
Yeah, that makes sense. I guess I have two more things I would like to ask specifically about. So one is, part of these seminars is these seminars are going to be available to people in LD, and given the increasing prevalence of K-debate in LD, are there any implications that you think of in the context of psychoanalysis versus more traditional moral philosophies vis-a-vis thoughts of things like, I'm thinking about things like Kant, virtue ethics, maybe like pragmatism, get a bit of duty in here. Are there any
The answer to that question is, I think there's actually probably a lot more interesting arguments that you can use psychoanalysis for that you might never have the opportunity to in policy debates. Zizek has a whole early book on Kant, and he has a recent book on Hegel.
The one that came out this year, correct?
Yeah, I think he's got an earlier about it too. But yes, right?
I mean, Zizek's talked about Hegel a lot.
Yeah, exactly, right? And because in Lincoln Douglas, there's still a mix of different philosophical and political or policy-esque arguments, there's still the opportunity to have a very esoteric discussion about Kant or virtue ethics or pragmatism or other things that LD is interested in itself and not just in relation to a political question. And so there's just more links and critiques out there, right? And that's a good example of like how a policy can go wrong. Like you could have a good political program, but if it's motivated by a Kantianism that's questionable, a Kantian ethics that should be critiqued, right? The negation of that philosophical framework is as important as the political program that would implement it.
That's fair. And then the other question I had is the coming policy topic. I don't know if you've seen it, but you probably have, given with your work with Yetnev, this criminal justice reform. Are there any sort of like implications that you think are immediate apparent for psychoanalysis and for that political question, especially given, of course, the recent uprisings, protest riots, whatever have you call them, vis-a-vis the death of George Floyd and several other black people at the hands of police here in America? And the sort of renewed public interest in this, it's obviously kind of a hot-button issue, I think more so than anyone really thought it would be when the topic was announced, or leaked, I should say. But are there any sort of interesting, both like in terms of just like readings or sort of specific authors or thoughts you would or people you'd recommend looking into, and just general thoughts about the role psychoanalysis can play in sort of thinking about the politics of criminal justice?
Yeah, so let's separate this into two questions. The first is recent Black Lives Matter protests, and also about the sort of more abstract criminal justice system, like being in a courtroom, etc. Now, these things are obviously related, but I think that we can get at two different aspects of these, and either one of them would be a sufficient place for critique. So let's first talk about Black Lives Matter. I think it's really interesting to see that the play between the universal and the particular that's involved in the Black Lives Matter movement is really well illustrated by the last few decades of debate in psychoanalysis about the politics of the universal. When people reply to the phrase Black Lives Matter with the phrase all lives matter, what you have there is a struggle about who gets to define the universal. And there is some really great stuff. The book Contingency, Hegemony, and Universality is a classic. It has Ernesto Laclau, Slavoj Žižek, and Judith Butler, all some of the most important theorists of the last 40 years, debating questions of universality that are exactly like this. Žižek also talks more about this subject in his book, The Ticklish Subject, which deals with a lot about the universal and the way that social exclusion motivates radical change in the definition of the universal, right? And there's discussion in psychoanalysis about the politics of abjection, or the part that is excluded. And in the phrase Black Lives Matter, what you see is the part that is excluded asserting itself as the true universal, right? And that type of political statement, and the reason that it works psychologically and culturally is something that's discussed extensively in the literature of psychoanalysis. Let's take the criminal justice system as a slightly separate example. We know for a fact that our criminal justice system isn't rational, right?
Say it ain't so.
The most shocking realization from Foucault's Discipline and Punish, and I mean shocking when it first came out, was the way that Foucault showed that even before prisons were the primary method of punishment in Western culture and Western societies, that they were already being criticized and there were already calls for their reforms, right? So before prisons expand to be the dominant mode of punishment in the West, there are prison reform movements before there are prisons in some places, right? And if you look at what the demands and the critiques of those prison reform movements are, they line up almost exactly with what you can find in a major magazine, that article that was written literally this month. I read one recently, I can't remember it off the top of my head, but it's just like a recapitulation of what people were saying in the late 18th century, right? The 1790s, the early 1800s. And what that shows you...
I get what was being said. I just want to ask for context.
There's too much recidivism. It teaches people to be criminals in jail. It's inhumane. That there's abuse by the guards. That it doesn't rehabilitate people. Like, pretty much the gamut of all the... If you can find an argument today, you could have probably found it back then. But prisons don't work, right? They cost a lot of money. They don't actually solve crime. All the other brutalities that go along with the prison system. So the question for psychoanalysis becomes why? Why are people so invested psychologically in this form of punishment? How does desire relate to this? And one of the things that certain psychoanalytic theories talk about is they use the example of a courtroom as a place where fantasy plays out, right? In particular, when judges who should just be implementing the law sort of take on the role of, say, the superego, right? And give these really rude, vituperative monologues to people that have been convicted, right? Where it's almost like the punishment is personal, right? To understand that dynamic of cruelty, of superegoic cruelty, and how it plays out not on the macro structure, but on the microstructure of the criminal justice system is something that psychoanalysis has a lot to say about.
That's fair. Are there any specific readings that you could think of or recommend, specifically, I guess, in that context, specifically in the context of like the criminal justice stuff? I know you recommended Hegemony, Universality, and Contingency for the example like Black Lives Matter and protest movements. If you can't, that's fine, and I'm sure I can like go out of my way to find some and put them on the reading list. I just wanted to consult the expert.
I definitely have an article in my head, but I don't remember what it is. It might have been a while since I read it.
If by any chance you find out what it is or remember it, just feel free to just like shoot me a message. Yeah.
I hate to be the debate coach. That's like, I promise you that it exists. Just go find it. Right?
Just like look,
I got to do that.
Patrick, look, I'll get you the link updates before the Shirley. I promise. Just like give me a bit. Never gonna let you live that one down. No, no, that's fair. No, thank you very much, Ricky. That's totally fine. Like I said, if you do find it, message it to me, and if I find it, I'll message it to you, and I'm sure it'll be the exact one you were thinking of if I happen to find one.
100%.
Yeah. I would also say, just like a side note, just from my reading stuff I've been looking into lately, specifically sort of psychoanalysis applied to the context of the politics of race. Some stuff that I found very interesting. Sheldon George's work is something that I've sort of been engaging a bit lately. I find his stuff, in particular, I find his commentary and sort of critique of like the Law of the Father, I think, quite poignant. And also, Dead Subjects by Viego is a book that is on my reading list that I have heard nothing but good things about. I don't know if you've read it, but yeah, those are just things that I would recommend.
Yeah, and I think that there's this actually points us to something that's a bit of a conundrum in the psychoanalysis literature, is that sometimes you can find really good, interesting stuff about a subject that isn't really good debate cards. And don't be discouraged by that. Like, you know, there are whole books about psychoanalysis and race that you'd be hard pressed to actually cut 2 cards from, but they could be really instructive and
make you better at explaining the cards you do have.
Yeah, and also just like, you know, debate isn't only about winning debate rounds, it's also about the pursuit of knowledge. So, you know, if something is interesting, hopefully you'll find cards, but, you know, sometimes you just got to read something because
for sure.
It helps you see the shape of the world.
Yeah, like it is worth noting that you have like dedicated a not insubstantial portion of your life to research in this field for non-debate purposes.
Yeah, and psychologically, I'd hate to think that I wasted all of that. And, you know, like I said before, I think that what's interesting about this is that no matter whether you agree or disagree ultimately, as you can with any philosophical, political, psychological theory, the good thing about psychoanalysis is that it gives you a structure that you can build off of to disagree and compare to other structures, right? It gives you an explanatory model that you can compare with other models until you find the one that you think best fits the empirical reality of the world. Although if it fits perfectly, maybe it's the wrong.
Yeah, maybe at that point I think you are missing the point. Yeah. All right. I think do you think there's anything else that you would just like to add last minute, or do you think that's a good place to sort of end all of this?
Oh, that's definitely a good place to end all of this.
Wonderful. All right. Wonderful. All right. Just the last thing, opportunity for you. Just plug whatever you want here, I guess. You can like plug the UTNIF, talk about like stuff that you're interested in, that you're working on, that you think people like might be interested in. Yeah, like you can say whatever you want in this part. Just you've been generous enough to donate some of your time, so now we'll donate their last bit of this to just sort of, I guess, or to you guys just sort of bring attention to whatever you feel like should be brought attention to.
Well, I don't really have anything to plug that I came with. You know, I am the director of debate at the University of Houston, and I think that one of the great things about debate is that it gives you the opportunity to study and research a lot of different styles and types of arguments, things you would have never encountered before. And you know, that's what we do here at UH. So if you want to come do that with us, you're more than welcome to. But if you want to just talk about it with us, maybe you could even, you know, reach out to people. And I think that it's good to find a place where you can do this. So if you do LD and you're watching this video, you know, it's good to know that a lot of similar discussions can happen in policy. And what's important is debate and the ability to research, discover, and bring to a community new ideas and ideas that interest you and help you understand the world better.
All right. Yeah, obviously I'm a bit biased, being that I'm one of Ricky's debaters, but that being said, I have very much enjoyed my year so far as part of the UH debate program. For anyone who's interested in it, we do have a debate scholarship now, I think, Ricky, don't we? Yeah, so totally look into that. What's it called? It's named after a person, and I always forget.
It's the Honors Hibbler Debate Scholarship.
Wonderful. So you should go look into that, because I don't know anything about it, because I started debating here before it became a thing, but it is a thing that we have. UH Debate also works a lot with the Houston Urban Debate League, which is an organization that is cool and good and does good things. It helped me, like get connected to the schools that I coach for now. But yeah, I just want to once again say, just like before we sign off, just again, thank you for donating, originally what was going to be an hour and now quite a bit more than that of your time to speak with us today. We really appreciate it. And yeah, I think this has been a wonderful enlightening discussion. I hope that any students out there who are sort of watching this lecture and maybe had some interest or questions about psychoanalysis are leaving this with their interest increased and their questions perhaps decreased. Or maybe increased, but desire to sort of answer those questions on your own, and that's the beauty of it. All right, I don't really know how to end this, so cheers.
Thanks for having me, Patrick.
Of course, my pleasure, Ricky. Thank you for donating your time.